Merci beaucoup. To our outstanding speaker, the Honorable Bob Rae, and commentator Paul Heinbecker, to our distinguished guests, Senator de Bannet and the Honorable Alan Rock, to Canada's living national treasure, Terry Mosher, aka Aislinn, who's got to be the best political cartoonist in the world, to the Member of Parliament, Dr. Nicolas Di Iorio, who is going to be leaving us briefly for 2 votes in the House, but then will be returning, he has promised. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, bienvenue. Nous sommes ravis de votre présence, surtout si nombreux, et merci à tous et à toutes. Je m'appelle Margaret Huber. Il me fait grand plaisir comme président chapitre de la capitale nationale du Conseil international du Canada et en nom de nos partenaires, le Centre international de recherche en développement, IDRC. Thank you so much for the multi-year financing we have been enjoying. To le Sheraton Ottawa et Audiovisuel Canada, un grand plaisir de vous accueillir. Our distinguished guest speaker needs little introduction, but he will be introduced at greater length by our moderator, Paul Heinbecker, who will also be offering comments. For those of you who have not yet had a chance to read the online description in our event announcement, we are fortunate that Paul Heinbecker will be moderating tonight's talk. Former Canadian ambassador to the UN, he was chief foreign policy advisor to then Prime Minister Mulroney, head of the Canadian climate change delegation to Kyoto, and is author of Getting Back in the Game, a foreign policy playbook for Canada that I highly recommend, particularly to the students who are here among us tonight. And you may not know, but Paul is a former hockey star and a devoted dad who's later going to be taking his daughter Celine out for a birthday dinner. Bravo, Paul. Through a dedicated team of volunteers, the CIC's National Capital Branch offers our members and guests access to a wide range of distinguished speakers, policy experts and influencers shaping the world's debates and discussions on global trade and economic issues, security, politics, and other compelling topics. Once again, thanks to dedicated and outstanding speakers, we have tonight convened an amazing crowd and a wonderfully diverse group of participants. I do hope that during the networking reception earlier, you had a chance to chat with as many as possible of the other attendees. And if you didn't, come back for further events and have another go. At the end of tonight's panel, and after what will doubtless be a very lively Q&A, and I count on you, chers membres, to make sure that it is lively and that you ask your usual very high caliber of questions. At the end of that, our panel will be thanked by our past president, Dr. David Dement. But in conclusion, let me mention a few of some of the upcoming events organized by the National Capital Branch at which I hope we'll be seeing more of you, particularly the many among you who are not yet CIC members. On Wednesday, for example, our Africa Study Group will be having a panel on Canada's military mission to Mali. What are we getting into? On May 1, our Latin America and Caribbean Study Group will focus on drug trafficking. On May 10, we'll be back here at the Sheraton for an evening with G7 Sherpa Peter Beam, speaking on the lead up to the G7 summit taking place in Charlevoix, June 8 and 9. On May 16, our Africa Study Group will again be featuring a special event on maturing Sino-African relations, since that is a theater in which China seems to be filling some sort of void. Then in June, come and join us again here at the Sheraton with the Minister for Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, on climate diplomacy 2 years after Paris. What's next for Canada? So join us then. I'll be back to speak briefly after the Q&A, but now let me ask Paul to begin, and over to you, gentlemen. Thank you so much, once again, both of you, for coming to join us.
There's probably no other audience that needs to have its speaker introduced less than this audience does. And there's probably no other speaker who needs less to be introduced than Bob Rae. I was asking myself what I should say by way of introduction, so I did the appropriate thing and looked it up in Wikipedia. When I got to the bottom of page 7, I decided that wasn't going to work. I'll say two things only. One is that Bob Rae, Mr. Rae, is probably the best Prime Minister Canada never had. And it's symptomatic of his entire career that he picked a subject such as the Rohingya to spend energy and thought, creativity, and indeed courage on. He's a man who has not shrunk from challenges in the political arena, not shrunk from doing the right thing when the circumstances might have made it a lot easier to do otherwise. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Bob Rae. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul. I'm delighted to be with you tonight, and I'm sure you may or may not remember the first time that we really engaged professionally was when you were ambassador to Germany, and I was Premier of Ontario, and you were very generous and thoughtful in introducing this young whippersnapper to a group of German business leaders who were enormously skeptical for a whole variety of reasons, and Paul was very helpful in reassuring them that I was not completely crazy in that first encounter. I'm very grateful to the Council and to Margaret for this opportunity. I'm also slightly nervous, you'll appreciate, because looking around the room, and there are some people here who've known me since I was literally a little boy, and who were colleagues of my father's and my mother's. So that always makes me very self-conscious. which I'll get over as time goes on. And there are many people with whom I've been working very recently who know far more about the topic that I'm about to discuss than I do. And this is a tough crowd from many different perspectives, but it's very kind of you to all come out, and I hope we can have a good discussion. I learned long ago that it's important to keep on trying to learn, and also to recognize that one's education is never completely over. And I certainly don't regard the report that I wrote as the final word or the definitive account of where we are. But I thought what I would do tonight, in I hope not too long a fashion, is to try to situate the current Rohingya crisis in the context of where we are today in the world, which seems like an absurdly large topic. But I have on other occasions described the world we're in as a world without adult supervision. And somebody said, well, what do you mean by that? Are you attacking Mr. Trump? I said, no, not necessarily. There'll be lots of time and opportunity for that to happen. But it's more that I'm trying to describe what other observers have said, which is that we are in a moment where certainties, seeming certainties of the past, no longer seem quite as certain. That certainly, in going back to a book that I wrote a few years ago called Exporting Democracy, I had a much greater sense of confidence that while the growth of democratic institutions was not inevitable, it was nevertheless something that one could see as a potential direction of history which we should be encouraging. I think today we have to say that democracy is facing many tremendous challenges in the world today, both internally and externally, inside many countries that have previously thought of themselves as being intensely democratic in their orientation, and certainly in the context of a global situation which is, to put it mildly, in the middle of turbulent and difficult change, both economically, socially, and politically. And while this may seem like a 50,000-foot view before we zero in on, imagine Google Earth zeroing in on the west coast of Myanmar and the Rohingya, I wanted to try to put the crisis in a bit more of a context, because I think so many of our reactions to the situation seem to presume a kind of moral certainty and a moral consequence to our outrage that we think should automatically lead to certain key next steps. And I don't think we should be as arrogant as all that to assume that the answers to the current crisis are easy, or that we can necessarily fully understand the consequences of any one of the potential steps that we might take. So I mentioned economically as well as politically. I think economically we're in a time of enormous turbulence, where the gap between rich and poor is growing, not only domestically but also internationally, where some nations have managed to move forward at a rapid pace, particularly China and a number of other Asian countries, and others have lagged seriously behind and are facing tremendous challenges. An optimist would say that, well, things are getting better because people are better off and there are fewer really poor people than there have been before. But the reality is that the extent of the change and the pace of the change and the pace of the way in which economies are themselves being transformed has ended some of the certainties that we thought we had before. We assumed, in the words of President Kennedy, that a rising tide would lift all boats. Instead of which we found that a rising tide lifts some boats much higher than others. And some yachts are doing very well, and others are not doing so well. And this is true domestically in every country as much as it is true globally. The second phenomenon is that the strength of international institutions has not been able to keep up with the pace of change. And so there's enormous frustration with the gap between the institutions that we have created and their ability to resolve disputes and change behavior. And there are many people here who have more memories of this than I do, but certainly by reading, I feel it's very much part of my own personal history. If you take your mind back to 1945 and the world which was then in place, the victors, if you like, decided that the world would change, that institutions would change, and that norms would change to reflect what they felt were universal values. That was the spirit that informed the creation of the United Nations. It's the spirit that informed the Charter. It's the spirit that informed the Declaration on Human Rights. It's the spirit that formed the development of the GATT. It's the spirit that formed the Genocide Convention. It's the spirit that was reignited, if you like, by many, many Canadians, some of whom are in this audience, who will be very familiar with the steps we took as a country to try to express a consensus about human rights, about ending the use of force as a means of pursuing policy, about the steps that countries needed to take acting in concert in order to make sure that things were not going to simply fall apart, and a determination to extend step by step the rule of law, to say that we would not only create stronger institutions in terms of the World Health Organization and the International Labor Organization and the UN High Commission on Refugees and that whole panoply of international institutions which are still very much present today, but that we would also do everything we could to extend the idea that just as domestically we would have a rule of law, so too we would have it internationally. And just as domestically we count on a strong police force and a constabulary to deal with crises, as we have seen even today in Toronto, the speed with which our emergency forces were able to respond to a critical situation in which so far we understand 9 people have been killed by a van driving into a crowd of people at the corner of Yonge and Finch in Toronto. But nevertheless, you have to say, well, yeah, but our police forces responded enormously quickly. Our emergency forces responded enormously quickly. There was a sense of confidence in the public that at least our agencies of the public would be able to respond in an effective and an efficient way. Internationally, we had the same hope. In fact, many of you will be familiar with the famous speech that Winston Churchill gave in 1945 in Fulton, Missouri, where we remember Churchill's speech because that was the famous Iron Curtain speech. That was the speech in which Churchill talked about the fact that there was developing an Iron Curtain across Europe which was very quickly redrawing the boundaries of tyranny and freedom. But that was only part of what Churchill was talking about in that speech, because a great deal of the speech was not about that alone. It was about the fact that the world needed an effective constabulary to enforce the common values which even he admitted had flowed out of the Atlantic Charter, which he and President Roosevelt signed off the coast of Newfoundland. We're now living in a time when it's clear that the constabulary isn't there, that we don't have the means of enforcing the rules of conduct of international law, and that we are struggling every day to assert and deal with the consequences of failing to have that effective international authority that would end conflict. The other key development which is worth reflecting on, and I'm hardly the first one to notice this, but nevertheless it's necessary to repeat it over and over again, is that whereas when we came out of the Second World War, the great conflicts were between countries and between empires. We'd had 2 world conflicts in which the battles essentially were between countries, between empires, between large ideological systems that were geographically based in different countries. That's not been the case so much since 1945, with the exception of the Korean conflict and the Vietnamese conflict. But when we look at the conflicts in the world today which have dominated and affected so much the human circumstance, they're conflicts within states. And so a conflict within a state poses a particular challenge for the UN. Now, Canada, along with a number of other countries, tried very, very hard under the leadership of Lloyd Axworthy, among many others, to establish an extension of humanitarian law which would actually take away the notion that we can't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. That we would go take the next step in providing security of the person to saying that the state is not an amoral actor, but that the state has an actual legal obligation to protect the security of its own citizens. And that if the state is not able to do that, then the neighbors have an obligation to do it. And if the neighbors can't do it, then global institutions have a responsibility to do it. And this doctrine, known as the responsibility to protect, in a sense became a foundation of our approach. But I want to suggest that that foundation is severely challenged at the moment. And the reason, not the reason, but the reflection of how it's challenged is the fact that during the debate at the General Assembly, first of all, you couldn't get it through the Security Council, because the Security Council would never have approved the responsibility to protect. And so it went to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly approved it. But one has to recall that some of the most significant powers in the world rejected the notion. They did not accept the idea. And so the idea is there. It's present in international law as an expression of opinion, if you like, of the General Assembly. But many, many key actors, India, China, Russia, to mention just a few, and the United States, did not actually embrace the idea. And so, just as the International Criminal Court was established, the Rome Statute was passed, but not everybody has signed up, we find ourselves, in a sense, between two worlds. Between the world of Westphalia, if you like, the world of sovereign states doing what they want, when they want, and how they want, and a world in which we say, no, that's not good enough anymore. We need some stronger norms, and not only norms, but institutions to enforce some powerful notions of our common humanity. We're not there yet. And that, I think, is one of the challenges that we face in the world today, is that we don't yet have the institutional structure that allows us to respond effectively to the crises that we see taking place in so many states around the world. We don't have it. The other factor which I'd like to introduce, really the other two big factors I think we need to see when we look at the context in which we are dealing with the Myanmar crisis. The first is the rise of Asia, which we sort of talk about, but I don't think we've fully absorbed the extent to which China and so many other countries have really leapfrogged their way in the last 25 years from being so far behind in terms of economic development and political power to being in a completely different situation. And I mention this because so many times in the context of Myanmar, people sit around and talk about what we can do. Meaning we's who? Who is we? As if the Europeans and North American powers had a huge rock bed of influence over the government of Myanmar. It's a myth. We don't invest very much in Myanmar. We don't engage very much with Myanmar. They didn't engage very much with us. And while all these barriers and pillars were being put up during the time of the dictatorship from 1962 on to this day, China was investing. China was doing business with the economic units that are created by the Myanmar military. And so every time we push, I had a very interesting comment from a senior official in Myanmar when I was there. He said, Mr. Ray, if you push too hard, all you're doing is pushing us back to China. And so we need to understand that. It doesn't mean we don't do anything. It doesn't mean we just say nothing to be done. It means that we have to be understanding that the key regional powers in the region, China and India, have far more influence than we do. And so our influence is not negligible, I'll come to that in a moment, but it's not as all-encompassing as we might think that it is. The second context that I want to just refer to before turning my attention to Myanmar in particular is this crisis, the humanitarian crisis, which you're now facing, and Paul is working with Lloyd Axworthy on the World Refugee Council. Alan Rock is involved with this great project as well. And it reflects the fact that we now have more refugees than we had at the end of the Second World War. Imagine the total destruction of Western Europe, of all of Europe, East and West. So many people in IDP camps, so many people in camps of one kind and another, so many people traveling across Europe, not trying to find themselves, not knowing where to go. Complete destruction of so much. Today we have more. We have a global crisis. If you take in your mind's eye, if you look at a map and you go across from Myanmar across across west through Afghanistan, through Pakistan, through Iran, through Iraq, through Syria, and then you start going down through the Horn of Africa, through Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, South Sudan, all the way down the Nile, down to the depths of the map on the Democratic Republic of Congo, 65 million refugees, more than we've ever had before. And a world which is hardly capable of knowing how do we respond to the extent of this crisis. So that's another context in which we have to place the million refugees that we find in Bangladesh and the hundreds of thousands who are in IDP camps or basically in a state of lockdown in Myanmar. Finally, I'm a great believer that as important as the global context is, it's important for us also to understand something of the history of Myanmar and something of the history of the entire region. So for those of you who have forgotten or perhaps never studied or didn't think about it, I just make a couple of observations. The first is that there was no border between India, the Indian Empire, and Burma for about 125 years. Burma was part of the Indian Empire. It was ruled as part of the Indian Empire by the British. And so what is now Bangladesh, what was then Bengal, East Bengal, there was no border there. So when Burma achieved its independence in 1948, it immediately the conversation and the cultural dialogue began to shift again to saying, among the Barmar majority, to say, we want our country back with defined borders and defined membership. Who is part of us? So there was actually a long process of expulsion. Indian people who practiced law and had businesses and from India, from China, were said, you're not a citizen here, and it's time to go home, time to go. And so there's been this process of growing nationalist feeling and this world of ethnic conflict, which is still in place today. I was chatting with somebody who said that they'd been there in 1974 and there was trouble in Chin State and Kachin State and Shan State. Well, there's still trouble in those places. There's still people losing their lives. There's still people getting killed. There's still planes flying over and dropping bombs. There's still military conflict in all those parts of the country. They're still there. And at the same time, the issue of one group in particular was virtually from 1948 onwards, always treated as something different from the other issues and other conflicts. And that was the situation of the Muslims living in Rakhine, who we now know as the Rohingya. And Rohingya itself is a contested word. When I go to Myanmar and I use the word Rohingya, people say, no, 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 no. Don't use that word. And as I was beginning this task, I said to somebody, why, like, explain to me what this is all about. Rohan means from Rakhine, Ja, a person from Rakhine. And in the Rohingya dialect, it means I come from Rakhine. I am a person from Rakhine. So of course, the Myanmaris say, well, you've just tried to end the argument by using a phrase, because we don't think you come from Rakhine. We think you come from somewhere else. Now, we have to understand that when we talk about coming from somewhere else, it could have been 200 or 300 years ago, or 400 years ago. So you kind of have to say, well, I mean, as a Canadian, we say that's fairly recent. You know? That's not so recent. That's quite a long time ago. But there it is. And it's one other historical fact that's important to realize is that the British, as they did in many other places, were not afraid to pit one group against another. It's this very familiar pattern. It's called divide and rule. And when the Japanese attacked in the Second World War, Aung San, who was the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, as a young soldier in his late 20s, was trained by the Japanese on the island of Hainan, came back to Burma, fought against the British with the Japanese, then flipped and fought with the British against the Japanese in order to get independence for his country. But it's important to note that the Rohingya were always on the side of the British, and there was significant intercommunal brutality in the Second World War, but on both sides, between the Rakhine Buddhists and the Rohingya. So you have a conflict which has been there for a long time. You have an intense rejection of even the right to exist of the other in their country. And you have a situation which has never effectively been resolved, and a situation which has only gotten worse. So the question for us is, there was a conflict, series of things happened, many hundreds of thousands of Rohingya went to Bangladesh, came back again. There have been 4 separate agreements over the last 25 years between Bangladesh and Myanmar, which people have been returned. Slowly but steadily, citizenship being taken away, not recognized, people not able to trade effectively because there were civilian boycotts going on, huge issues locally in a part of the country that is always conceived of itself as being different and independent on its own and struggling economically, one of the poorest parts of the country. We now have a situation where there are 1 million Rohingya living in Bangladesh. 700,000 left after the fighting started between ARSA and the government forces, the military, Tatmadaw. And those 700,000 left in the space of about 5 months. So we now have the fastest growing, worst conditions in a camp of anywhere among the others that I've described. Because so many of the others are in better climates, or they've taken longer to build them, or there's been greater understanding as to how the camps would be set up and how they would be run. I'm not saying any of the camps are great places, but those people working in the UN system will say this is the worst. And it is the worst that is now getting worse because the monsoon rains have started. I was talking to somebody today who described a situation where they built free learning centers for kids, and they completed them about a month ago, and they've all now been, the roofs have been destroyed by the rains. We have a situation as far as public health is concerned that's going to be as grave as any ones that we can imagine. People don't like to use the word cholera to describe the conditions which are there, but there's no question that there is a serious, serious risk of a major cholera outbreak in the camps. With the rains taking away any sense of protection for sanitation and for drinking water, it's a terrible situation. So I come back to this question, which I really posed at the beginning when I was asked to do this job by the government. Why are you doing this? Like, I'm happy to go and try to figure out what Canada could do, but is this something you're taking very seriously? And they said, well, yeah, that's why we're asking you to do this, because we want to take it more seriously. We know there's much more to do. So what I tried to describe in the report is basically 4 things that we have to work on as a country, and that I think will help us to be able to look in the mirror and say we're doing what we can to deal with the causes and consequences of this terrible conflict. The first is that we have to deal urgently with the full extent of the humanitarian crisis. That's both in Bangladesh and in Myanmar. In Bangladesh, we have terrible conditions, but we have more international access. So we can begin to really work hard on how we can improve the situation with greater access. But we can't do it on the cheap as a country. We can't say, well, somebody else is going to come in with a big check. We'll come along, be just behind with a little bit, so we can say we're doing our bit. That isn't going to work. This is what I mean without adult supervision. The way the system works today, and the system is truly broken, the refugee system, is as a crisis breaks out, the UNHCR and the other international agencies come around basically with a begging bowl saying, please fill it up, fill up this bowl. And countries say, well, we'll give this much. So you have this statement by the agencies, we need, this year, we need 950 million US, which is over $1 billion in our money. And we're nowhere near subscribed. We're nowhere near committed. And everybody's kind of waiting to see, well, who's going to do what? And my sense is Canada has to really understand this system is not going to be fixed unless we're all prepared to spend more money. Not just Canada, and not just the Rohingya, and not just Myanmar, and not just Bangladesh. The world crisis is going to demand a much greater infusion of funds. And that's why I think the World Refugee Council's work on where can the money come from? What else can we do to get the money? How else are we going to finance the consequences of what's happening in the world today is, I think, one of the critical questions. It's going to be discussed at the UN General Assembly in the fall, and let's hope that there's some willingness to consider what needs to be done. The second thing is we need to look at the political situation in Myanmar, and here it's difficult because of some of the factors that I've described. We don't have quite the influence we might have thought we had. We are facing a challenge with respect to how do we move things along. Only 2 international agencies, well now a little bit more the UNHCR, but for the most part in the last several months, only 2 agencies, the World Food Program and the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, have had access to the north. And we know that conditions in the north are terrible. Terrible. And we know that people are feeling at risk of their lives. And so that is a situation we have to deal with. A number of people in IDP camps, a number of people who are extremely vulnerable, and we have to insist that whatever we do in terms of a greater aid and greater assistance has to be matched by an expansion of international access. And unless there is a renewal of the peace process, and people talk about this as a democracy in transition, well, we have to kind of call that and say, where's the transition? Transition to what? Where is the transition coming? And, you know, there are examples of armies that have given up their political power. There are examples of armies that have said, we're taking a step back, we're going to retreat to barracks, and we're going to let the civilians take over. That did not happen in Myanmar. That is not the circumstances under which Aung San Suu Kyi came out from house arrest. That is not the case in Myanmar. The army controls the central institutions that are at stake in Rakhine and in much of the country. They control the border areas, they control the army, the military, the Ministry of Defense, and they control the Ministry of the Interior, which, almost like the old French Ministry of the Interior, remember, where a Minister of Education would look at his watch and say, I know what every student is studying in every single school in France, every class. I can tell you what's on their curriculum. I can tell you what they're learning right now. This is a highly centralized bureaucracy in which local governments are responding directly to the central government, reporting on everything that happens and everything that moves. So I'm happy to engage in a discussion with anybody about, well, how much leverage does Aung San Suu Kyi have? I don't think we fully know the answer to that question. What we do know is that the army is very much a political as well as a military force in the country. And they are playing on issues around populism and nationalism and ethnic sentiment in order to grow their power and their popularity. And like everywhere in the world, there's an election coming. And they're all looking to the election to see what they can do to increase their position, increase their power. So how Canada engages successfully, along with many other countries, is, I think, a critical question. It's not easy, but again, if we want to be present, we have to figure out what we're going to do and figure out the steps that we can take to do it. Third, we need to look at the question of impunity. So much evidence of crimes against humanity, so strong, so clear, the destruction of 400 villages, murder, rape as a weapon of war, forcible deportation, go down the list. And yes, as others have said, the hallmarks of a genocide, but remembering that a genocide doesn't start and stop on a single day. It's a process. And we have to stop the process before it goes any further. And we have to call it as clearly as we can, having done the investigation and due diligence that we have to do to make sure that we're accurate in what we say. And finally, we need to really build a coalition of like-minded countries. Talk to as many as we can in the Muslim world, in the Western world, wherever we can. Try to engage with China and India, as difficult as that is, and talk about the consequences of this level of dysfunction and of this level of hardship and of this level of uncertainty in a part of the world that it can't stand. You will have seen the news last week. A boatload of 75 arrives in Indonesia. Well, the refugee crisis is not going to be readily confined to one country. It isn't simply going to be Bangladesh's problem. It's going to become a regional problem and a regional issue. And it will not go away, will not ease up. So those were the 4 things that I recommended. Like many of you, I'm waiting to hear back from the government as to what they intend to do with my recommendations. But my final thought is that if we are going to get, to coin a phrase, back in the game, if we are going to go around the world saying we're back, well, what are we back to do? What are we back with? What are we up to? What are we really doing? And if I may say so, this is a moment and this is a test. This is a moment where we say, yes, we're back and this is what we're going to do. And there are a number of things that we can do. None of them alone will solve the problem. None of them will find a quick fix, which is why I've talked in the report about the 3 qualities it seems to me we need to have. And I'll list them and then I'll sit down. First one is we need to be present. What do I mean by that? Well, we need to answer the call when it comes. And we need to answer it in a way that shows leadership, in a way that says we're there. And we have to continue to say to our friends in the world who don't agree with us, we actually do believe in something called international human rights. We actually do believe in this nascent international legal order. We do believe that there are some values which are universal and which need to be protected. And we do think that human life cannot be treated in this way. And we do think that those who commit crimes against humanity should be punished for what they do. We believe that. Those are our values. And if we simply give up and say, no, let the others who say this is their sphere of influence, let them simply rule the situation, we're going to be untrue to our values, untrue to what we believe in. And we're also betraying all those people in each one of those countries who shares that view, who believes as we do, because they understand how much it reflects our commitment to humanity. We have to persevere, because this is not a one-day news conference. This is not a one-day announcement. This is not something which will make you look good for a day, and then you can go home and say, there, I've done it, I've looked good, another triumph. It's not like that. This is a tough, slogging path that has ups and downs, valleys, hills, everything. It's a very, very tough situation. And we need to persevere, and we need to be willing to go through this hard slog, because it's not going to be easy. And finally, we have to be patient, by which I don't mean indifferent or simply watching our watches and relaxing, but I do mean that we have to understand that this is not going to be resolved quickly. People are not going back to Myanmar in a few weeks' time or a few months' time. This is not that kind of issue. It's not that kind of conflict. It's going to take a lot more resolve and a lot more determination, and yes, a lot more patience. And if we are these three things, then I think we have a chance of succeeding with others. But it's going to be tough. As I was describing this situation to several people in the government, at the end of my presentation, the person said, well, do you have any good news for us? And I said, not particularly. And I don't think we should expect that the world is going to be full of good news. We know it isn't. It's a tough place out there right now. And we have to be prepared to go through with it and do things that, even though they're not always popular and not always easy, nevertheless is the course that I think we owe it to each other to try to pursue. So that's really what I wanted to say. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to any comments or questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
I think actually the good news is that people like you are engaging on this issue. It would be just as easy at your age and with the successful career you've had to be at the lake this summer. But the idea that you're taking on such a difficult issue with such insight and with such conscience, I think is something that we can actually take as the good news in this. You mentioned the World Refugee Council. I should probably tell people what that is. The World Refugee Council was launched by the Center for International Governance Innovation about a year ago with support from the government. Its chairman is Lloyd Axworthy. Alan Rock is part of it, as Bob just said. It's a council that has people from all around the world. We have an Indian member, we have a Ugandan member, we have a Tunisian member, somebody from West Africa, somebody from Latin America, someone else from elsewhere in Asia, Germany, Turkey, and so on. And we've traveled the world. We take the view that we can't really understand what we're talking about. We can't be credible by sitting in New York with some handful of intellectuals and figuring out what the problem is. So we brought together some of the world's leading academics, together with a number of civil society representatives, together with a number of political actors who know how to transform ideas into action. And we've taken on this large issue of refugees, of which the Myanmar situation is probably one of the worst, but it's symptomatic of the attitudes of the international community and of the disintegration that Bob was talking about. there's an important insight from Madame Ogata, who used to be the head of the UNHCR, and that is that there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. There are political solutions to humanitarian problems. And until the world decides that it's going to take on these issues seriously, we're not going to get to the solution. One of the problems that we see, among many other problems, is the toxic narrative. And the toxic narrative has a side to it that countries like ours and people, you hear that there are 22 million actual refugees. You hear that there are 40 million internally displaced people. You hear that there are 65 million people who need help. You hear that there are 250 or 60 million who are on the move. And if you're a government, the tendency is to throw up your hands and say, what can I possibly do about all that? But if you remember that refugees, which are a particular category, but refugees amount to 1/3 of 1% of the population of the world. We're not talking about impossibility. We don't have a refugee problem. We got a leadership problem and a vision problem and an attitude problem. And that's what has to be addressed. And that's what we're going to try to address with our council. And we are going to try to create a coalition of the willing. We are going to try to find countries from the north and the south who are willing to work with each other. The 87% of the refugees are residing now in countries outside their borders. But in almost all of those countries, the 10 leading countries, they're almost all developing countries. The whole idea of the UN Convention on Refugees was that host countries had an obligation to take refugees, a legal obligation, and the rest of the international community had an obligation to assist. Well, the poor countries have carried out their end of the bargain. If you go to places like, and they're not so poor, but they're not so rich either, Jordan has a situation where they have more than 1 million refugees. No one knows how many, 1.5 million perhaps, because most of them are not in camps. It's the most water-poor country, second most water-poor country in the world. Their water is disappearing while they're trying to look after refugees. Their school systems are burdened. Their hospital, their social services are burdened. And the international community has not stepped up in anything like the way it's necessary to do. The same thing could be said for Turkey and Lebanon. The same thing for Uganda and for Kenya and for Ethiopia. And it won't be very long before that's happening in Central America, it seems. So this is a big issue, and what's important in this case is that we have to get civil society behind us. We have to have people who will support us, who will push it in other countries. It's not going to do us, we're not going to get to the promised land by talking to government leaders and telling them they should do better. When they start winning elections again because they see advantages in refugees instead of disadvantages, that's when we'll know we've accomplished something. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions. Who would like to go first? The first hand is here. Mr.
Yeah, but I beat him.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for those comments.
Yeah, and the microphone is there.
I have to say I'm a bit depressed by the way you've described the situation, because I'm a kind of a Pollyanna Canadian who believes that we have a lot to offer and there's simple solutions to things. But one of the things you mentioned at the beginning of your remarks was the degree to which China and India have invested in Myanmar and in the region, and that we have significantly less influence because we don't do big trade and so on and so forth. So my question, I guess, is how can Canada, or if it's an option, work with China and India, use our influence with China and India to take a much larger part in the stabilization of the political situation there? The 65 million refugees that you described along that path across East Asia and West Asia and down into Africa sounds to me pretty clear, it clearly follows the Silk Road idea of China's expanding influence. And so instead of us spending huge amounts of money in Myanmar, why not use our influence to get China and India more involved?
Well, I think that's something we should be trying to do. I think it's difficult. In the case of China, China has a very strong view about the relationship between development and human rights. The Chinese will talk a lot about their own commitment to human rights by saying that they've expanded the economy of their country to an extent where they've lifted hundreds of millions of their people out of poverty, and in that sense they've done more for human rights than any other country. And that's very much a mantra that you will hear in Beijing. We have a different view about individual liberty and its importance, and we have to be frank with them about that. But we also, I think, have to ask both the Chinese and the Indians a question, and that is, if you value stability, you're not going to be able to find stability without a commitment to both development and human rights. And in particular, the human rights that we see at stake in Myanmar is a recognition of the plural nature of the country. India understands that more instinctively because they have a tradition of some degree of pluralism, although that's constantly under challenge. But it seems to me that we need to at least try as best we can, together with a number of other countries, to engage the region, which means China and India and Indonesia and Malaysia and a number of other countries in the region, to say what's at stake here is stability and pluralism, human rights and development. It's not about picking one or the other. It's about recognizing that both are in play. China has significant economic interests in Myanmar. They want to build, get into this discussion as Canadians, they want to build pipelines. They want to build a pipeline across. They want to export natural gas. They want to import gas. They want to deal with their economic problems very directly. They're looking for a port on the Andaman Sea, which they want to have. And you say to them, well, if there's no stability in the country as a result of what's happening, then surely it's in your interest to help us find a greater degree of stability. That is not simply a theoretical discussion. It has to be a very real discussion. But I think we're testing, in a sense, the extent as well as the limits of our influence. And I think it's something we have to come to grips with, and that is that we need to work with others to extend the influence of those ideas, and I think work with those countries in that kind of a way. And that's certainly something I know the government of Canada very much wants to do.
Please.
Thank you. Akash Maharaj. Paul Heibecker started off this discussion by saying that you would need no introduction in this room. And I think it's fair to say that there are probably no rooms in Canada where you would need an introduction. But I say that not to flatter you, but to emphasize what I think to be the case, that when the government of Canada deploys Bob Rae on an international mission, it's doing so at least in part to be seen to be deploying Bob Rae on an international mission. My question for you is perhaps an unfair one, but having declared it to be unfair, I'm nevertheless going to ask it. Do you think that the government of Canada is serious about making a long-term investment of money and political capital in this issue after the attention of reporters have wandered and after the lens of the media has pointed in another direction? And if the answer to that is yes, what is it that makes you believe that to be the case? And if the answer is no, what is it that people, those of us in rooms like this, need to do to make them serious about it?
Great. Well, I mean, I've tried to give a short answer. I mean, my sense is it's not about giving anyone the benefit of the doubt. My sense is that it would be a little odd, I would think, to ask me to do a report in a very public way, and they would probably have a fair sense as to what I might or might not say in my report, and then turn around saying, well, that's all very interesting, but we don't intend to do any of it. I think that would be bizarre, quite frankly. I think the harder question, though, is this issue of perseverance. The issue of presence is partly a moral question, but it's also partly a political and financial question. And that is a question of how much are we really prepared to spend and to show that we're doing in order to show that we're present. Let me give you some, just little examples. We don't have a political officer, and there are many former diplomats here tonight. We don't have a political officer in Yangon. We don't have a military attaché in Yangon. So you kind of have to say, do you really expect one or two people on their own bat to kind of do all of this intervening and connecting? If the government is serious about taking the steps that are required, they're going to have to spend more on diplomacy. And they're going to have to spend more on what it costs to have officers overseas. They're going to have to fight the fight with Treasury Board and Finance and everybody else and say, if you want to have, whether it's hard power you want or soft power that you want, whichever it is that you want, you have to spend money on both. If you want hard power, you got to spend money on that. You want to have soft power, you got to spend money on that. And it means building up a capability to deal with the extent. Look at the situation in Bangladesh. You cannot deal with a humanitarian crisis of that size unless you have the people who are there who are able to deal with it. Otherwise, they'll just get burned out and leave after a year. So the real test will be, if we're serious about saying Canada is back, you say, show me. Tell me how you're doing it. Show me, not just in terms of speeches or what you say or resolutions, because those things are, frankly, easy. It's about whether you're willing to actually put things in place which demonstrate that you understand the extent to which you take diplomacy seriously. Now, as everyone knows, I come to everything with a lot of baggage. But the advantage, and Paul referred to my advanced years, but the advantage is that I got nothing to lose. So I think together with a lot of other people, I'll have something to say, because this appointment doesn't last forever, if nothing happens. If I don't think the government is living up to its obligations, then I intend to say so. But I don't think that alone I can have much impact. I think the question you pose is a really, really key one. And that's what's so troubling, is that in today's world, look what's happened in the United States, and look what's happened in the UK. You take those two examples and you say, is there really a sophisticated foreign policy thought behind much of what is happening? Are there the resources in place to show that? No. And that, I think, is the troubling thing we have to recognize. And that's where it is about public opinion saying, well, this is the world we live in. And Paul's talked about that in terms of the refugee issue. But we do need to ask ourselves the question, how can we as individuals affect the opinions that need to be developed in order to have a truly sustainable foreign policy? And I think that's a question and a challenge for all of us, because people will say people don't vote on foreign policy, but the reality is foreign policy matters to this country because we're so exposed to all the changes that are happening in the world. We're not a superpower. We're a country that's deeply impacted by what's going on in the world.
Before the next speaker, I just wanted to make a quick point, picking up on something that Bob just said. That is to say, when you're looking at the refugee issue, there's a moral argument to make, and everybody understands what that is, I think. For the smarter people, there's also an economic argument to make. That, think of how Canada has profited from the waves of refugees which have come to this country. We probably benefited more than anybody else has from the flows of refugees, and we've integrated people probably better than anyone else has. We can blow our own horn on that. But there's also a strategic argument to make, and that's the one that you make with the harder heads in Washington and other places. You can connect the dots from the civil war in Syria to the refugee flows, to Brexit, to the rise of the right, and maybe even to the election of Donald Trump. If you're going to take a holiday from the world, this is what the outcome is going to be. So, let's connect those dots. Let's try to make people understand that if they want stability, if they want progress, they really have to get engaged in the world and not let things fall apart the liberal international order that we all grew up with is a cracking. And we might end up sooner, it may not take 25 years for the bottom to fall out. It might take 25 days one of these days. Thanks. Next.
In a room full of...
Paul was saying that just so you were getting cheered up by what you were hearing before.
In a room full of very eminent and worthy people, I kind of feel a bit strange. I'm speaking from the trenches. I spent 4 years in Burma, 4 years in Bangladesh, and just recently I spent 8 weeks at the mine face in the Cox's Bazar because I wanted to understand, I'm from Asia, what was going on. I'm a little bit more optimistic, sir. I think that what we consider the liberal order may not reconstitute itself as we see it, but I think there are, across the country, you'll see this in that, countries, there are embers and fragments. So I think I'm not as pessimistic, but I'm not unrealistic. Mr. Ray, amazing report, but then what else did we expect from you? What we will hold the government account is that having mobilized you, if they then hand it over to some non-entity, then we know that they don't want this to go any further. Because as you said, sir, it is a job of enormous, the convening power that you need alone and to bring partners on board. In a securitized world, sir, what do you think? China and India both have security interests. The northeast of India is very, very sensitive for India. It is not another flashpoint that they need there. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think we gave up on Aung San Suu Kyi too early, especially the many, many friends in this room, and I think I'll be beaten up when I say this, but we need to continue to engage with not just Aung San Suu Kyi, this was the big problem of personalizing it, but with whatever the NLD and allies are, because we need people to take forward that agenda quietly and dealing with the military as they have done. I think the Burmese clergy actually is not all toxic. The chief of the clergy has actually forbidden that toxic monk Vithura, and I'm a Buddhist myself, from speaking. He's not permitted to speak. So I think we should not give up on Burmese institutions such as they are, social institutions. The whole conversation of these last few months has been very, vindictive. They've done a terrible thing, let's whack them. I don't think we're going to get very far with that, and I'd like your note on how do we deal with the fallen angel that is, at least in the West, that is Aung San Suu Kyi. I also just want to remind you, there has not been a comprehensive peace agreement in Burma to this day. The Kachin, the Shan, the Wa, these are significant groups that are outside. So I think the issue of the Rohingya can be seen in that possibility, in that framework of taking forward, and that would be very, very, I think, good. But so you're, about engaging with Burma as much as anything else. There is some ideas floated at a recent meeting about sending peacekeepers across the border. That's what the military would love, because they will see it as an invasion of Burma, and then everybody would have to, lockstep. So let's not give the military what they want. Thank you.
I agree with that. I'm very sympathetic to your arguments. I think, as I said, I don't feel that I know enough to say with certainty what is the game that's being played out here. But I do believe, as you've described it, that there still are a lot of people in the political structure inside Myanmar who believe in a plural Myanmar, who believe in a pluralistic country, and who believe in the rule of law. I don't think all those people have disappeared. I think they're still there. I think everyone is bewildered by the ability of the debate to turn on this issue of ethnic identity and ethnic nationalism. And yeah, it is a toxic thing when it happens. It's toxic wherever it happens, whenever it happens. And it's tough to deal with. I've never had a private conversation with Aung San Suu Kyi. Every meeting that I've had with her has been of a semi-public nature. That is to say, 10 or 15, 20 people in the room. So I don't know who every person in that room is. So I can say what I want to say, but she has to be careful what she says in public. And I think, Kofi Annan said to me, he said it in a number of other occasions too, but he said when I met with him in Geneva, he said, the trouble is that people thought she was a saint, and then they discovered she was a politician. I didn't take that comment amiss. I mean, I think we do have to understand that she is in the middle of a very difficult, an enormously difficult political situation. And that's why I think engagement is required. At the same time, I don't think we should be hesitant to continue with the process of creating as credible a process of investigation as we can to determine what happened. Because I believe we have an obligation to do that. And I don't think we can run away from that obligation. I mean, a number of people have said to me in the region, oh, well, we'll get to that later. I said, no, you can't wait. You've got to deal with it now while the evidence is fresh. You can't ignore it. But I also don't agree with those people who say, let's just go after Aung San Suu Kyi. Let's bring down the whole structure. And you sort of say it's an illusion to think you can do it. And secondly, it will only intensify the military control of the country, which strikes me as the wrong thing to do.
John Noble.
A former diplomat who had the pleasure of having Bob Rae at the residence in Bern for 2 of my Christmas parties, where he's a distinguished pianist as well as many other talents. The former government, which I don't give much credit to did one good thing, and it dealt with another refugee group from Myanmar, the Karen. They took who were persecuted, except the big difference, of course, was they were Christians. And the government took in a couple of thousand, and then because of the sponsorships privately, they brought in some more. So I give them credit for that. But then, of course, they dropped the ball on the Syria issue just before the election. But it seems to me that public attitudes are something serious. The Syrian refugee issue seems to have gone away. We did our part, we obtained that objective, and nothing happened. My question is, do you think we should, as it'll be tokenism, should we take in X number of Rohingya refugees and make a challenge to the Canadian population to match that, or et cetera? Or do you think that's not something the government's likely to take at this time, as well as filling up the UNHCR bowl with money?
I've encouraged them. In my report, I've been very explicit saying I think it's entirely appropriate for us to be starting a conversation with other countries and with the UN about taking in refugees from the Rohingya community. There already are a couple thousand Rohingya in Canada. I think it's entirely appropriate that we not simply shut down the conversation. I think we need to understand that we're not going to solve the million any more than we, quote, solved the Syrian refugee problem by taking in 25,000. But I do think we should start the conversation, and I think it's entirely right for us to do that. And I've very explicitly asked the government to do that, and we'll see what their response is. I think it is a good idea.
We have 10 minutes left, I think. Is that right? And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 questioners. So maybe 6, it looks like. Could we take all those questions one after the other, and then you can respond to them as you see fit, and if you forget one, I'll remind you.
I'm writing them down.
Okay, please.
Barb Darling, I'm a former president of the CIC in Ottawa. My question really is to focus on the responsibility to protect the RP2 that we were one of the sponsors of. And at the time, it was understood that it was a high moral ground to take, a new direction to go, but at the same time trying to envisage how it might actually work, especially to prevent as a last resort force, as the intervening approach. Now, my question is, given your experience in Burma and Myanmar with the Rohingya, how would you actually see the responsibility to protect working? And if not, what needs to be done about it, about the principle?
Next.
Hi, my name is Abby Jan, and I'm also a former Canadian diplomat and a member of the CIC board. My question is a little different. It has to do with the role or influence of Buddhism in this whole arrangement. Buddhism as the middle path, peaceful coexistence, etc. It's always very sad when you see a self-identifying majority Buddhist nation engaging in the kind of things that we see in Burma or that we saw in Sri Lanka. What was your reading about the influence of Buddhism, and particularly the religious authorities and structure, in terms of this conflict? And does it even matter? Thank you.
Please.
My name is Noel Lomer. I have just a brief comment to take a look at the historical and geographical context of this crisis. There's been a series of primarily ethnic conflicts in Myanmar that began shortly after independence in 1948. Burma has about 14 national minorities, and conflicts with the central government have continued for the past 70 years. There have been major ethnic conflicts in the Kachin, Kaya, Kayan, Rakhine, Shan states, and against the Karen. And their conflicts have been characterized by the brutality and slaughter exercised by the Burmese army. There have been ongoing sporadic violence between government forces and insurgent groups, particularly in 1995, when several nationalities rose up and nearly toppled the central government. China rescued that regime when it was nearly bankrupt and financed armed purchases, which enabled the government to crush the opposition. And in return, the Burmese government granted China the right to log and clear-cut the entire border area of teak and other timber to a depth of 60 kilometers from the border. So my point is that the Rohingya crisis is not new. It's characteristic of the Burmese nation. It's not going to change due to the efforts of the international community, including Canada. In my own opinion, the best assistance Canada can give is to assist Bangladesh in absorbing the mass of Rohingya refugees. Thank you.
My name is Nicholas Baird. I'm with the World Federalist Movement Canada, and my question draws from the remarks made on the Responsibility to Protect framework. And since there was already a question on responsibility to protect, I'll just add why it wasn't examined more fully in the report. Thank you.
My name is Jean-François Tardif. I'm with Results Canada and also the Rohingya Human Rights Network. And I was very excited to see in your report. You were looking really at what Canada could do, and you invited Canada to look at a contribution of $600 million over the next 4 years. Would you say that contribution should mainly go towards supporting the government of Bangladesh to take care of the refugees on its soil, in other words, through bilateral aid, or filling up the bowl of UNHCR? In terms of what Canada can do, also multilaterally, is there something Canada can do in the UN system, the World Trade System, the international financial institutions? I see, for instance, the World Bank engaging with Myanmar, and would we have actually tolerated the same thing if the Hutu government was still in power after the massacre? Would it be engaged and allowed the World Bank on our behalf to engage with them and other financial institutions and the UN, et cetera?
Last question.
Yes. Hi, I'm Pablo Mahana Sandoval. I'm an individual student member with the CIC. This is actually my first event, and it's a fantastic start. Thank you so much. My question is more theoretical. It's about Canada's place, and if we do have a place. I mean, just a few hours ago, there was another Saudi bombing of a Yemeni wedding that killed many women, children, including the bride, and it's just one part of it's just a pattern of that conflict. You mentioned earlier, Mr. Ray, that we had to prove that Canada did believe in international human rights and the international legal system, and how do we prove that credibly, given our silence on the crimes being committed in Yemen by the Saudis with our military support and diplomatic support, and our silence on the indiscriminate killings of civilians in Palestine by the Israelis? Thank you.
Well, I think, let me just start with that question at the beginning, is to say there will always be debates and arguments about conflict and who's responsible for conflict and what is the basis of the conflict. I'm in the proud custodian of my father's papers, and my father, as you may know, had Mr. Heinbecker's job only about 20 years before he had the job. So it was, it's quite fascinating to see in his own time. I mean, he lived through the beginnings of the Second World War and then was a Foreign Service officer through all the period after that. And there have been many, many arguments, particularly if you take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that has roots that go back deep into the region. And I think that the position that Canada has taken is actually the right position. I think we should be articulating it more often. And I think the first thing we should be saying is there is no solution unless there is a two-state solution. If we do not have a Palestinian entity that is able, as a state, to function effectively as a state, we will not have peace in between Israel and the Palestinians. And as John Kerry said before he left office, he said if we don't have a two-state solution, we will only have a one-state solution, which will either be completely unacceptable to the Israelis or completely unacceptable to the Palestinians. So I don't think we should hold back from saying what we think about the nature of that conflict and what we see as a solution. I think we need to find our voice again in trying to articulate what do we think is happening in Yemen? What do we think the solutions are? Do we believe that there's a military solution to the conflict alone? Or do we seek some further, deeper political changes which will lead to a solution? And I do think we need to find our voice on these issues. I think that's part of what I believe very strongly, is that we need to be able to articulate those in a consistent way. And by the way, we also need to be consistent in looking at ourselves. And when we look at our own situation as a country and saying, have we always recognized human rights in a way that we should have? And the answer to that is no, we haven't. So we need to be prepared to talk about that quite publicly. I'm going to try not to take forever to answer all these very, very, very good questions. A couple of questions on R2P. I think I described in my comments earlier in my speech how I think we could all say, yes, this is a good description of how things should work. I think where we are struggling is, so what do we do when it doesn't work? And if you have a doctrine which cannot be effectively be enforced, or you do not have a way of enforcing it, then you have a problem. So we have a problem. It doesn't mean we abandon the doctrine. It doesn't mean we say there's no validity to the idea that a state has an obligation to protect its citizens. To me, that's a pretty foundational argument. You can't just say a state there's no context of human rights inside a state, there's no context of protecting minority populations. You have to say this is part of what it means to be in a state. So I think the challenge that we face is, what do we do when it doesn't happen? Now that's one of the reasons, by the way, to the gentleman who spoke about how we should just give up on Myanmar and we should give all our money to Bangladesh and let them try and integrate the Rohingya. The Rohingya are not native to Bangladesh. They do not consider themselves to be Bangladeshis. They consider themselves to be part of the country that they call home, which is their home in Rakhine State. And they are prepared, they're clamoring for Burmese citizenship. They're demanding the rights to be citizens of Myanmar. So if we turn around and say, well, sorry, give up on that, And now we go to the Bangladeshis and say, your job is to take in 1 million people. You say, what? And where is the authority for us to say that to people? We can't say that to people. We have to say, no, you have a right to a home. You have a right to a place. And then you say, well, does that mean that we are going to send in troops? And I have to say to you, I did not find anyone in the region who said, or anyone in Canada, or in particular within the Canadian government, or the US government, or the British government, or any European governments I talked to, no one said, yes, we're going to send in our army in order to protect the people. And there are people who've said that's what should happen. It should be like Kosovo. We should go in and we should do it. There is a difference in history and there's a difference in geography. That isn't going to happen. There should be international observation. Will they be able to go back at some point? I haven't given up on that idea. I certainly haven't given up on that as being the thing we should be aiming to try to achieve. But it can't be achieved unless people are assured of their safety and of their citizenship. If we simply abandon them to another round of oppression and then coming back again, that would be equally irresponsible. On the question of the World Bank and financial institutions, well, that's an interesting question. If you look at a map and you look at the area around Cox's Bazar and you look at the area around in Rakhine State, much of it is not electrified, much of it is not developed, much of it has no infrastructure, much of it doesn't even have roads. People didn't drive cars to go to the refugee camp. They walked. They walked for days and days and days and days. These are dramatically underdeveloped areas. So, and this is one of the arguments I would make to the Chinese, say, you believe in human development? Well, then let's get to work. And should we use the international institutions to do that? Yes, we should. But we shouldn't say, we'll do that, but we'll ignore the issues of human rights. We'll ignore the issues of pluralism. We won't worry about protecting minorities. You say, that's not realistic either. We need to have both. So I think that at some stage, in some way, it's possible for us to imagine such a program. Not impossible, possible, but difficult. And we have to be realistic about what is involved in making this transformation. The last thing I want to just say is that a couple of people have asked me tonight about where'd you get the title from? What's the title? Tell them we're human. The title came from a conversation that I had with a man who was a school teacher who lived in the camp. And we had a very engaging conversation. And at the end of the conversation, I stood up to leave and I said, what do you want me to tell people when I come away from this? And he started to cry and he broke down. And all of the the things that he'd been holding back just gave way. And he grabbed me and hugged me and he said, tell them we're human, we're human, we're human. He repeated the word over and over again. And to me, that is the key lesson. And it's something that I believe profoundly, if I had as a human being, I believe very strongly. When we talk about dignity and recognizing dignity, that's what it means. We recognize the other and we embrace the other, and that is the foundation of how we get through life and get through the world. And so we have an obligation to recognize that at the core of this, it's an issue of, do we share a common humanity with people or not? And if we do, we can't just walk away and say we have no obligations. We have obligations. Yes, they're based on strategic interests. They're based on economic interests. They're based on all kinds of arguments that we can make in addition. But for me, at their core, it's about the love that we owe each other. And that to me is what should be driving us as Canadians.
I won't remind you about the Buddhist question.
Oh, Actually, I don't want to miss the Buddhist question, because I'm sorry, I missed it. It's complicated, and I think you have to distinguish between Buddhism as a political ideology in certain countries and Buddhism as a religious philosophy. Many people say to me, how could Buddhists do this? And I look at them and I say, well, how could Christians do what they do? How could anybody who's part of a religion do what they do? It's not because they don't have a faith or they don't believe in certain things. It's because in Myanmar and in Sri Lanka and in Thailand and a number of countries, Buddhism is not just a private religion. Buddhism is a cultural force that speaks to a particular national identity. And when that national identity feels threatened, look out. And that's no different in Myanmar than it is in Europe, anywhere in the world. You threaten people's identity and their sense of who they are, and they will respond. And it is I think one of the important things for us to understand, that there is this thing called Buddhist nationalism. It is powerful. There's also Hindu nationalism. There's Islamic ideologies. There are all kinds of theologies and ideologies which mix up religion and state cultures. None of us should be surprised by it. It doesn't mean that Buddhism is corrupt or that Buddhism is dishonest or any of those things. Not at all. It simply means we have to be realistic and show some understanding of where these political forces are at work. And there's far wiser scholars who've been writing about this for years than me. It's just something to be aware of, is that it's not a purely religious expression. This is not about religion. It's about ethnicity and nationalism. That's what it's about.
There it is. One last comment. It's something that Lloyd Axworthy would have asked me to say, I'm sure. With respect to R2P, it was in fact passed by the General Assembly, 155 countries represented by their heads of state, and it was passed by the UN Security Council, all 15 members, 15-0, which only makes your point stronger, which is to say, not only are they not doing what they should be doing, they're being hypocritical about it besides. Thanks. So I'd like to take, I guess I should take this opportunity to turn the floor over to Margaret.
Before I invite Dr. David Dement to offer the grateful thanks, because I know we all feel so privileged to be here, let me again thank all the distinguished guests who I mentioned earlier, all those who I didn't mention, particularly Dr. John Kokol of UNHCR, who's with us this evening, but to thank each and every one of you for being here for such a special evening. And after David's remarks, we will be inviting those who are not staying for dinner to find their way out the door, with a heartfelt plea, next time come and join us and stay for dinner. And over to you, David.
Well, thank you, Margaret. As the past president of the CIC in Ottawa, we're all very grateful to you for your magnificent leadership over the last 2 years, as we see here tonight, and the other organizers of the CIC. I feel a bit silly as an academic being sort of moved by a political figure. But I've got to say, Bob, you have been moving me now since I was a young person and said to myself, well, if that Bob Ray's getting up and saying those kind of things, I better make a commitment and do something, and he's speaking to me. And I looked over at my wife when you were talking about the love that we owe each other, and she had tears in her eyes. So you are still affecting people. I don't care if you're in your 70th year. You've got more road ahead of you, and a lot of us feel that and care about your future and your ongoing contribution. And it's a great privilege for all of us to have Paul Heinbecker beside you. I mean, you're both talking about getting back in the game, and you've both been in the game as practitioners, at making a huge contribution at the highest levels. Myself as a teacher, I know you both as teachers, especially you, Paul, and you're both active in the university setting, amongst other things you continue to do as practitioners, actually. Bob, I had the great honor of he wrote the foreword for a book I wrote, and he also, for Terry Moser, who's come up from Montreal, Asselin, the Montreal Gazette political cartoonist, you've also written a foreword to one of his books. You have many more books than I do, Terry. I think you have 50 or something. It's hard to believe. So I thought, what a wonderful thing. I'm at Chapters trying to sell my little book and maybe hopefully selling 40 a time and doing this actually a fair number of times. And I thought, well, this is, having Bob Ray as a forward, people will come up to me and say, David, I'm going to buy your book. There's Bob Ray, he's on the forward. But I'm really sorry to tell you, but more often than that being the case, normally white men of a certain age would come up to me and say, that Bob Ray, I'm not even going to talk to you. And I never understood it because you're so balanced and you're so thoughtful. But I think you really do engage, and you also, yeah, and you hit the mark, as you've sometimes said. If I got that reaction, it's because I actually hit a target. And you do it in a very thoughtful and balanced way that people should not be saying such mean things when they otherwise should buy my book. And I don't know if, Terry, you had the same experience, but I don't know. No? Okay. I just want to point out that we maybe should feel additionally special having you with us on this occasion, because it was exactly 6 months ago that you took on this responsibility, the 23rd of October, and now here we are, the 23rd of April. So I think that's somehow auspicious. All right. And speaking of Terry, and as Paul said, and I'll change it ever so slightly, with apologies to Robert Stanfield, the best prime minister we should have had, and rather than never had. But Terry handed me a little card. I had the pleasure of sitting beside him, and he said, because he's got his job to do, how many cartoons do you have a week in the Gazette? At least one, probably more. Anyway, you've got to get them produced. And you said here in this card you handed me, and it wasn't, I said to him after, can I say this, right? Because I don't want to, he said, it wasn't my intention, but yes, you can. And he wrote here spontaneously during your talk, I wish that Bob Ray was our ambassador to the UN. That way, I'd get to have the pleasure of drawing him again. And I'm just going to add, you have a wonderful combination of both style and substance, which we need both in our leaders. So thank you for tonight. Everyone enjoy their dinner. And until our next event, thank you.